Hello and welcome to the show Beyond the Journal, where we discuss social media, digital education, and current controversies in cancer and medicine. I'm Dr. Jack West, Associate Clinical Professor in Medical Oncology at the City of Hope Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area, and I'm joined today by co-host Dr. Charu Aggarwal, who is the Leslie M. Heisler Associate Professor of Lung Cancer Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania's Abramson Cancer Center in Philadelphia. Hi, Charu.
Hi, Jack. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Vince Miller, who is the Physician-in-Chief at EQRx and Thoracic Medical Oncologist in Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where he's been for several years. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Vince. Welcome.
So thank you, Jack. Thank you, Charu. And I would say it's been important to be able to go back to Memorial on Fridays and, still see patients and have that touch of reality sprinkled on me with the challenges we all face with this tough disease.
So let's start with your transition to an industry position. I've known you for many years as a respected fixture at Memorial. Obviously, there you had already been establishing the role for molecular marker testing and targeted therapies, and we're doing very pivotal research. I imagine it was a difficult decision to take an opportunity at Foundation Medicine, which is where you first left, but that was also certainly provocative work. Can you give us some idea just of your mindset and what led to the ultimate decision to make that big transition?
Sure. I mean, that's I still can't believe I did it. But I have no regrets. I, for years, had passed over, invites to look at this position, that position, went for a few interviews. But, it's really hard to rebuild or build what one has at a place like Memorial. But this was right around, the time when we had gotten over the initial excitement of EGFR mutations as a predictive biomarker. We had the papers linking mutations to sensitivity to drugs, and we were actually, rolling into the mature era of ALK-related testing and ALK inhibitors. And you really, or I, in perhaps my naivete, was really thirsting for that paradigm to apply to all my patients, find the predictive biomarker, apply the right drug, and voila, we generally have a much happier, feeling better, living longer patient, and the doctor's job is that much more gratifying in that environment. And I really wanted to see that pace of drug development and testing availability speed. And, it was interesting, EGFR mutations, we saw the first papers in 2003 and 2004, and yet there wasn't a commercially available test till 2007, 2008. I was seeing patients routinely at Memorial as second opinions simply to facilitate testing because we had an in-house test, and in process sort of gatekeeping things so that our molecular pathologists wouldn't be overwhelmed. So one of the, aside from believing in this paradigm of precision medicine and its potential, there was also this idea of access to testing, democratization of testing. And I wondered if, wealthy people from North Jersey can make it in to see me, but it was a bit of a convoluted scenario. What was happening in obscure places where there are maybe hundreds of miles from a center that might have testing? And so the concept was something I fundamentally believed in. The company's founders were great. We were, it was Eric Lander and Levi Garraway and Matt Meyerson and Todd Golub. Mm-hmm. And so I believed in the people, I believed in the science, believed in the medicine. I'd worked with Matthew on the EGFR mutation story. And so it was just happened to be right place, right time, right opportunity for me. And in the context of testing, it wasn't developing a single drug. So it was a little bit more de-risked than if you were taking a shot on a startup with one drug. And it was still, risk. I had my tenured position. I sort of, dragged my feet a little bit so that to make sure people didn't think I left for the wrong reason, and left on very good terms and built a good relationship, with Memorial.
Great.
You were one of the first people, I think, in the thoracic oncology world to really make that transition to industry. Since then, I think we've seen, really this move where, transitions to industry are actually viewed as very favorable. And, there are advantages to moving to industry. But back then, this was a one-off. This was not something that occurred all the time. Were you worried about it being, sort of like a career death wish, or something that you're getting into which may not be salvageable, if in case the opportunity didn't turn out as you wanted it to be? Did you think that you could still come back to academia, and what was some of your thought process behind that?
Sure. Great questions, Charu. And there were a couple of people who went before me, as I think back in it now, someone like Mace Rothenberg had done it, and William Powell, I think, had left shortly before for Roche, and he had worked carefully, closely with me on EGFR work. And I really, valued his friendship and opinions on things. But your point's well taken. I really felt that was the uniqueness of the opportunity, that this was such an outstanding group of scientists who were founding this company, who had generally, very impeccable credentials and motivations, that not only would it succeed, but if it didn't succeed, there would be tremendous learnings and improvements and understandings. I mean, there was some personal risk in it, right? And you certainly have to have a spouse or partner who is willing to accept that based on where you are in your life, with children and all those other things. But it was something I felt really good about, though. And I think that's the key. People, if you're going to look at one of these positions, any other position, it's got to be because you're in love with that other position, not because you're miserable at, wherever you are. And I love Memorial. I love it today, and I loved it then. Really hard work, but we all know that because we all do that.
What about you've had many colleagues, including at Memorial, not to mention other people who we all know in the thoracic field who have made the transition. And I agree, you were it's not unprecedented. It was just not as, you made it cooler than now it's trendy. But, if someone were to say to you, I want to try this, do you think a one-way door, or is it something that you can see how it works out and go back? I mean, we've seen Leena Gandhi go to industry and return to an academic position, and she's not the only one. In many cases, people do go and thrive and continue either in the same company or go from one company to another, often upwards. But if you were to talk with a friend and colleague who's thinking about this, what do you tell them about the reversibility of it?
Yeah, great question. I think it's somewhat institutional dependence. I saw Peter Adamson went to Sanofi recently, right, Charu? Who has I don't know if he's the CMO or not. Pediatric oncologist at Penn, who I worked with decades ago. And he has, I believe, an emeritus appointment. I think it really depends on your relationship with the institution, what terms you leave on, your transparency, and the institution's philosophy. It shouldn't arbitrarily be a one-way ticket. If an individual leaves, and I think it's really important to build that. That credibility factor. And I think it also makes a difference where you go. If I had, let's say, gone to develop, the 85th taxane, that might have been perceived a little bit differently than if I, arguably had the foresight and willingness to try to bring tools forward that would be part of the toolbox. And that Memorial built their own test. They were able to, as I heard you talking about on one of your podcasts recently, sort of the different worlds that people live in as far as access to testing. So I think that's also a piece too.
Yeah, and I will add that I think so many of our pivotal oncology trials today, as compared to the year 2000, are being conducted by industry. So I think many view this this being the move to industry, really being a way that they can directly further impact patient care. I think we've had guests on the show before where we've talked about the relatively low impact. I won't say no impact, but relatively low impact that we have in cooperative groups now conducting phase 3 trials that lead to either clinical trial, lead to approval of drugs, or really define the new practice standard. And I think we've seen this much more so in the last 5 years, that industry is really setting the agenda. So I think many people are feeling this, that if they wanted to make a change, maybe being at the table where decisions are being made in industry can better serve patients. What do you think about that, Vince?
I think you're right on, because if I'm reading you correctly, and I think part of the inference there is that the tools to make good drugs that are fundamentally impactful, whether it's, and this gets a little bit to when we talk about costs, but the tools are so much better that when you go to industry, you can have that really good feeling like you really are helping people and changing lives as rapidly or more rapidly, perhaps, than you did in an academic career. Because most of us went into this for the desire to help a lot of people with a god-awful disease in general. And so that's the premise. I don't think, Levi Garraway would have gone to Lillian Genentech if he didn't think the drugs were really good and could really, help a lot of people, and we could have a step function. Whereas for years it was sort of, what new chemo do we have with a twist, that acts in a different part of the cell cycle, blah, blah, blah. And those were incrementalism is best. And the better ideas probably were in much of, in academia by and large. I think the other thing too, just feel free to shut me up here, is, in industry, there's much more centrality of focus around one or two goals, and you sort of have to be on board. You can have a dissenting opinion and change people's minds, but it's not like if you get held up 6 months in something, that's a big deal. There's ownership of that, and you have to explain that, whether you're a public company or a private company. Whereas in academia, we all at some point probably dragged our feet on a paper, or didn't submit a grant on time, or shot down a protocol at the IRB that held up someone's idea that was really good for 3 months. And there aren't, people usually don't measure or follow that as much in academia. I think there's, there should be more accountability to and in some way calling out people for really exceptional performance in academia, and those who are, sort of two standard deviations below sort of the mean or median of performance.
Now, you spoke about the move to foundation being, at a time when good molecular marker testing was not a given, was not readily available. And you presided over, were a key part of Foundation's move. Guardant obviously has helped as well. There's several other competitors in the space, but we live in a different world now where that barrier of not having ready availability of testing does not exist anymore. But we have other barriers. We don't live yet in a world where everyone is getting molecular testing and the results are being acted upon. Looking back a couple or 2 to 3 years ago, there was the Singhal paper in JAMA that came out of Foundation and Flatiron, and that looked at results that were done already. So you don't have a denominator of all the people who might have been tested but weren't. So we don't know from that the proportion who didn't get tested. But one thing that I would say was not talked about or played up very much for as important as the result was to me was seeing that among patients who had an EGFR mutation or an ALK rearrangement, a disheartening proportion did not ever get a targeted therapy for that. And it was far less if you looked at other mutations that were less well known. Was that talked about much, or do you have any thoughts about where the apraxia is that is keeping results from getting enacted upon?
Oh gosh, yeah, I agree. And this is part of when we talk a little bit more about EQR. It's part of the thesis, right? We're doing these amazing things scientifically, technologically, new drugs, amazing imaging. Can't we nail all the low-hanging fruit? Like, is it really that hard? And so, if you do, premise one, don't do a test unless you might use the result. So did the doc not see the result? Did the patient go to hospice, before the result came back? Did the patient refuse the drug? I'm sure you probably know more systematic reviews of these things, perhaps, but it is indeed discouraging. I mean, that number should be like 5% or less, right? It's just. I'm a pretty simple thinker. Like, let's clean up what's easy or ostensibly easy, and then we can figure out, what do we really combine with checkpoint inhibitors to make, have the next meaningful step function, and what, if anything, is the biomarker for that?
Well, because these were patients who you've already covered the issue of there isn't enough tissue, because they had the tissue, they had a result. It got presumably sent to them. So it couldn't have been teed up better than here's an EGFR mutation, you know what to do now. And then nothing happens. And we don't really know that. I personally feel we need to spend a lot more time and effort on the execution science, the implementation science of what's actually happening or why it isn't happening, because coming up with all the mechanisms for acquired resistance in rare mutations doesn't do anything if people aren't acting on the results that are put on their desk already.
Yeah, it's another interesting phenomenon. I'd be curious what you see. And we've had some studies or preliminary, data analyses with, payers or enclosed healthcare systems where you look at what EGFR TKI they're getting, and there's still patients in the U.S. being started on Tarceva or started on afatinib. And that's a drug I developed, and both drugs that, I helped develop. But, for a canonical EGFR mutation, that's not the best option in 2021.
Yeah.
And I don't know, education at cost.
I wonder if people are hoping to sequence or something like that. Maybe that's the reason. But anyway, I think.
I'm glad you're an optimist, Jack. No, I think that's, I'm sure that's true in some cases.
You talked about, delivery of targeted therapy, but, we've also recently, emerging from the ASCO annual meeting, seen some really disheartening data about testing in the first place. Large data analysis from the Flatiron registry, evaluating, testing across all patients with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, and really highlighting the disparities that exist amongst, African-American patients and perhaps, Latino patients, where they have even lower rates of testing. One of our initiatives has been to improve testing, really incorporating plasma. When you were at Foundation Medicine, did you see differential sort of institutions that were more likely to send specimens to you? Was there an emphasis from academic sites, or was there, robust participation from community? Because one of the things we worry about and we see is that maybe academic institutions are doing a little bit better, but community sites are not really as well. And is that the reason for the disparity? What was your take on it while you were at Foundation Medicine?
Well, there is, I think it's sort of, there's a bell curve of adoption of anything, right? And generally, and we're all cynical about certain things, but generally, academic centers and thought leaders are sort of usually to the right on that bell curve. And that's why we do trials and try to develop new drugs and new tests. So initially, all the fervor was from academic institutions. And, how you handle, and so it was great because we developed tremendous champions. They were at arm's length from us. They would publish, and we would give them data sets, and so it really developed our credibility. And then those institutions, over time, and they would critique the test, and oftentimes you have to take that in the right way. Why are you missing this percent of that, or why are you characterizing this as a VUS when it's clearly a driver? And at the same time, though, as they started, some of those institutions at a different rate developing their own tests, there was also, you start to get the uptick from different community centers for greater and greater interest. Even within community practice, you'd see sort of to be the one person who was sort of, for lack of a better term, the leader, the right of the bell curve, where they were, doing, let's say, creative or unorthodox things. And that might have been the first person to order foundation testing regularly. So I think it's probably not dissimilar from some of the other efforts. We spent a lot of time trying to meet with groups. I think there were different reasons. It was gated by the pathologists, and the pathologists are at arm's length from the patients usually. And it takes a really dedicated clinician or team to really work closely with them in a partnership. Sometimes that relationship can almost become adversarial. We're giving our tissue away and we're not gaining anything by it. So that's a piece of it. I mean, you got to keep the end game in mind, that there's, a patient at the end, and the medical oncologist, who arguably knows the patient the best, thinks this could be potentially of help. So let's try to push it out the door.
Vince, I don't know how involved you were in the overall structure of and language of a report, but I think one of the potential explanations for the difficulty of translating results into practice is that many places, at least over time, the reports border on inscrutable. I mean, they're extremely long. They can be 50, 70, 90 pages. And, they don't, too often they don't say, this is an activating EGFR mutation, or this is an ALK rearrangement. It shows, some combination of letters and numbers that even if you know what an EGFR mutation is, you might not recognize that result, especially if a place reports 12 or 15 or 20 different genomic abnormalities that might be buried in it. I feel like sometimes it's like there's a diamond in a dumpster that someone has to find because you've buried the EGFR mutation amongst so much junk. And, there's that. And then the issue of whenever a place says, well, there was an animal model that suggests that everolimus might work for this, this mutation. I feel like that's a potentially harmful thing. I mean, I've seen people say, I was going to give chemoimmunotherapy, but then I saw that, this ATM mutation could respond to everolimus. So I've decided to do that instead. And, we don't want people to leapfrog investigational stuff with little or no clinical data over the stuff that's a standard of care. So I'm just interested in, whether you have ever been part of these discussions, or maybe were in charge of the whole project of what, a report would look like, and whether the volume of it may be too much for clinicians in practice. And obviously you want to justify the cost of a test, but I feel like it has to be translatable quickly if someone is going to read it and then go into the exam room and talk about it.
That is a complex question, with many dimensions to it. I think one thing that we did address as part of it, and that I was really excited about, and actually has sort of raised the bar for molecular testing, and that was taking Foundation One through the parallel review process with FDA and CMS, because it highlighted that there was an import, to these tests, and B, as part of that, the front page, the first page of a Foundation One report would focus on any identified alterations linked to an FDA-approved drug or one that was contraindicated in that tumor type. So that process, although that wasn't the primary reason it was undertaken, I think made docs more comfortable than say, page one is where the money is. And maybe the academics and others might look more beyond that. So it allowed sort of a executive summary, perhaps, for lack of better piece. The second piece, I don't think certainly at Foundation Medicine, we weren't thinking about, paper generation to justify cost. It was more, there's a fine line between so much of what we found, the exact clinical significance of was truly unknown. But just like you want a CAT scan report that says there's a 2 millimeter pulmonary nodule, significance unclear, so you can retrofit that and figure out if something happens, just like maybe we had met splice on there, 6 years ago and there was no drug. You want to be able to use that information because we are learning rapidly in this field. As far as the evidentiary standards, that's a great question. And actually recently, someone we all know well, Christine Lovely, was chairing some sort of meeting about this and reached out to me for my input beforehand. And we had an army of PhD types, certainly young enough in many cases to be my offspring, who would comb the literature. And we really developed what we thought were reasonable criteria. Obviously could be critiqued, but that, for example, if we're going to mention something as a potential therapy, there had to be at least one or more responses in a human being with that mutation in that tumor type or something like that, rather than, because you can find a cell line or xenograft to support anything and to contradict the same thing probably. So I agree that is overreaching it, and were we probably guilty of it at some point in our genesis? Sure, but I also think it's such a moving target, and some of the things may have come forth since that time and be proven, and some have been maybe refuted, and iterating and updating that content then, of course, is critical.
Yeah, I think, I would really like to know from your perspective or from the lens of industry, we all see that there are barriers in molecular testing. We know that it's becoming increasingly important every single day. Just to give you an example of what you just pointed out, MET splice mutations have become immediately actionable. We tend to see all these barriers from an academic lens and, what we can do and, we can educate. But what were some of the efforts that you were involved in at Foundation Medicine? And, I think it'll be really important to partner with industry in the future. So what are some of the initiatives that you undertook, or, are there barriers that can be surmounted from an industry standpoint?
Sure. Well, I think maybe the barriers then were different than those now, because one piece, that was very important was even publishing the analytic validation of a several hundred gene test from the standpoint of calling, the 4 major classes of DNA-based alterations. And that was something people hadn't done. And we were doing it in that case, both to show the rigor that should go into this if it was going to ultimately drive decision-making in the clinic. And because so many would say, "Oh, our test is CLIA approved," and that's a great first step, but it's it's necessary but not sufficient. And similarly for CAP, and so that was one piece. And then similarly taking the test, so reimbursement, of course, right, out of pocket, whatever it is, we had as liberal as possible plan to mitigate patients' financial burden. But that being said, that was always a concern. And it was a concern in the doc. Would the patient be calling their office 6 times or walking in with an EOB and holding, backing their clinic up? We've all been there. And so that was part of it. And then actually what would hit the patient. And so part of that was then working, taking the test through FDA and CMS, because those would facilitate coverage from payers, and of course have one of the biggest payers, Medicare, covering a FDA approved genomic profiling test. So I think that was part of it. Recently, I noticed something though that you both of you may be more aware of. It was really a combined effort among ostensible competitors. I think like Guardant, FMI, maybe a couple of others on, sort of preaching the value of comprehensive profiling, I think in liquid and solid, in an educational effort, which is clearly, part of this also. Because when you're an oncologist in practice, like, Met splice, but if you're seeing every tumor type, in a very busy private practice, are you going to be on top of that?
I think it's a real challenge, in part because, again, if you run the numbers, I'm not sure it is worth, private practice general oncologists who treat 15 kinds of cancer every day to dedicate the cortical mapping to a 1% population that they might see once every 3 or 5 years. I mean, maybe you just take the zero on that. In that sense, I think that, if you just send NGS, you don't have to worry about remembering to send a specific test for, NRG or something. It's just, it's baked in as long as you get a result that you can recognize if it comes in and it's highlighted properly, but you can't anticipate that general oncologists who see everything, and, all of us, we don't have to know everything about, or even the general basics of lymphoma or colorectal cancer as well. So, I mean, there's only so much you can know. And I think that it's not necessarily incompetence or something to look at things and say, I think I'm just not going to dedicate the hour to learn about this 1% mutation I might never see in the next 2 years. Yeah,
totally. I mean, it's funny you say that, Jack, because I would chuckle at people who thought all of us probably were so professorially unknowledgeable. You basically just had to know, 2 diseases, and a bunch of drugs. There's guys in practice who are like swapping out, metastatic colon, endometrial, lung, and then lymphoma. Like, how could they possibly be abreast of things?
And especially when the advances that we're seeing are happening in most cancers simultaneously. But let's turn the corner. And one of the other limitations, we've talked about cost of testing, but the cost of the drugs, I remember when we crossed like a $10,000 a month barrier for targeted therapies, and it seemed like a milestone that, like, we just can't keep doing this. And now we look back and think, well, that would be quite a bargain week. I mean, that's like drugs on super sale right now, clearinghouse. And so now many of our drugs routinely are $15,000 and $18,000 a month, and that doesn't limit their being used necessarily. We do gnash our teeth a bit as we talk about that, but it's an almost seemingly inelastic system where you just pay whatever it costs, you're going to pay it. What I think is more frustrating is that we live in, a capitalist society broadly. And one of the tenets is you come out with competitive drugs that should check prices and keep them from escalating. But we've seen multiple checkpoint inhibitors that produce remarkably similar data, and the third and fourth entrant into the market comes in at essentially the same price, often with the same data and no clear incremental benefit. Same could be said for various ALK inhibitors. I mean, it's one thing to test in a different setting, but they're not necessarily testing head-to-head against this year's model. They're testing against what we used in 2015 or 16, and so what? So now you're working at EQRx. They have a tenet of coming in with drug options that may or may not be better, but are at least a lateral move in efficacy and tolerability, and are going to cost not 5% less, and you might debate the worth, but substantially less. At least that's the promise. How big a change is that? And, is that going to maybe be disruptive to the entire oncology market? And, will it actually happen? Because I think that there's certainly skeptics out there who say, yeah, I heard that. I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, I mean, just on that last point, if I were in my old seat, I'd be one of those skeptics too, right? And when somebody's talked about something forever and it never happens, that's the natural response, right? So onus on us to, to put our money where our mouth is, or lack of money where our mouth is, and price accordingly. I think this is something, maybe not you, Charu, but in my era, we were just completely sheltered from this. We didn't think about this really at, when I was, I didn't at MSKCC. I just wanted to get the best drug for the best patient. And I figured, insurance gets it covered. And if I had to write some letter, we just put the memorial icon on the top, and that usually got it approved, which was great. But it is a real deal. When you look at, if you look at, I saw some data, and I forget where, I don't think it was published, but basically, for example, looked at the proportion of patients in a Medicare population with EGFR sensitizing mutations who say get an appropriate agent versus those in a sub 65 population with the same mutation. For some reason, it's much lower in that Medicare population. And that's probably because those patients, unfortunately, and there could be differences, but those patients can't participate in, rebate plans and coupons and things like that, as best, I understand it. And I think a lot of the workarounds have really been almost perverse ways to sort of navigate a somewhat dysfunctional system that's been in place for so long and that no one can just really deal with. But you alluded to it earlier, Charu, with all these people going to industry who seemingly have, see the light there for developing new drugs. Why does the cost of a drug that's essentially similar to one already available, but is lagged to develop, say, 3 to 4 years later, exactly the same? I mean, the cost, this is no longer take a shot in the dark, try to circle around a target. This is more like, precision engineering for some of these things. And some of the chemistries are amazing, like with the bispecifics we're seeing and so forth. So look, if somebody comes forward with an amazing drug for Alzheimer's, that's, maybe that's different, when it truly works in a high percentage of patients or whatever. But that's not innovation to come out with the same price drug, that's developed 3 years later, produces the same data. That's like gilding the lily or whatever they say. So, I think that our premise is that this shouldn't stifle innovation. This should facilitate it. And, we have one of our early drugs, a third-gen EGFR TKI, aumolertinib. We looked at assets from all over the world. This isn't a China phenomenon, and partnered on this drug. And we've had a lot of inbound requests to partner on that, both because it creates a little safety valve in the system. If you had some gazillion-dollar MET inhibitor or some drug you want to put with it and you're thinking of a combo, well, maybe it diffuses the sticker shock of that if it's effective. Mm-hmm. And also, not every company has, a really robust, say, EGFR TKI. Osimertinib's a great drug, but that's one company. So we think there's, it's an interesting, sort of dynamic that's going to play out. And I've talked to a lot of doctors, and Jack, I know you tweet about this a lot. There's folks who it's going to be really interesting. Like, what happens if drug gets US FDA approval, or a drug does? It's priced at a fraction of the cost of a competitor. The data ostensibly, the data set might lag a year or two just by chronology of development, but the data look robust. What will doctors do? And why will they stick, and why will they change? I mean, we tend to be creatures of inertia. So that's one thing I say we always have to overcome. But other than that, it's a really sort of fascinating time. This is going to be thrust upon us, though, right? I mean, I think in general, Rick Pastor said it's not where, and I don't mean to paraphrase him, but it's not where a trial's done, it's how well it's done and how well that biology is recapitulated, from country A to country B. So someone's going to come in and, undermine the current pricing structure. And we think, in general, it's better to start with, people who sort of have a good experience in this, know the targets, will hold high standards. These drugs have to be as good or better, though. We can't, once you start to trim on efficacy, it becomes a whole different world. That's the necessary but not sufficient. So some high level comments there, Jack. And I know you could do your own podcast on this. Well,
but I think that, the potential benefits, one of the ironies of osimertinib is that many of the places that enrolled the best on the trials with osimertinib don't have access to the drug in their own healthcare system after it's approved. It's So having an aumolertinib, if it is coming in at 40% of the cost of osimertinib, suddenly makes it possible to treat these patients with a drug that produces great results, but is available to far more people, and it's potentially less of a challenge for copays of patients in the U.S. or maybe other parts of the world who, where the cost is of osimertinib is attainable but higher, and just the impact on broader society. I mean, if we are talking about giving adjuvant osimertinib, but it's 3 years of that, and that bill gets passed on to people in higher premiums, that impact would be less if you can achieve the same result with another drug that costs less than half. I think the big potential there, obviously, for that, we'll see the data. I think we still need to see overall survival and CNS activity. As you said, it needs to prove to be equally, at least equally efficacious and not significantly more toxic. But if a company can still make a profit from it and produce something that fundamentally changes the cost structure, I think it would be amazingly disruptive, if for no other, and partly because it shows other companies what's possible and could kind of break this détente.
Yeah, I don't know how we are on time. I think that's all really well said. It's funny. I look at guidelines more than I used to. We used to think, right, you have your own guidelines in your head, right, Jack, when you practice, and the same with Charu. But now I actually look at them, and there's all these things. Well, if you can't get a first gen, get a second gen. If you can't get a second gen, if you can't get a third gen, get a second gen. Can't get a second, get a first. Like, where does that really apply? There's really places where it applies. And that's sobering, because the differences are, quite meaningful.
Absolutely.
Well, Vince, this has been an incredibly enjoyable conversation about, transition to industry, molecular testing, your impact on the field, and now with innovative drug pricing and all the work you're doing at EQRx. So thank you so much for joining us today. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you find your podcast content. We hope that you will subscribe and send us comments and feedback to beyondthejournalshow@gmail.com. We thank Mark Lindsay and Talking Speaker for production and distribution support. See you in a couple of weeks with our next guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.